So let's start creating our employee department grade app. Now I've got a blank web app that I've started up here. So you can see all it currently has is the home web, the front page of the app. I haven't customized that or changed any of that. And the other 4 things that we normally see inside my first module. Now this app is going to be storing and manipulating a lot of data. So let's do a little reminder of the way that databases save information. And I'm going to use Access here just for a visual representation of that. So here's an Access database. And this is a database that we've used before in previous modules. And we've got 3 tables over here. We've got the department table. And you can see that the department table's got 3 pieces of information in it: department number, department name and location. And those are called department number, dname and loc. You can see obviously we've got 4 rows here. Depending upon the database course that you've done before, you might be used to talking about these as if they were relations and tuples or tuples. I'm just going to talk about tables, rows and columns to simplify things here. So there's my department table. I've got an emp table. Now the emp table is information about employees, and it's got employee number, name of the person, what job they have, what their manager is, who their manager is, that's the ID code of the manager, when they were hired, whether they get paid a salary, what the salary figure is, commission is optional, and what department number they're in. So you can see we've got a bunch of columns there, lots of data already stored in here. And then we have the grade table, a third table which shows information about the salary ranges that are appropriate for every kind of job that there is. So if you're on grade 2, if your job is classified as grade 2, that means the salary range that you could earn would be between 22,000 and 23,999. Now you're familiar, hopefully, with the idea of tables with rows and columns. But part of the reason that I'm showing Access is because I want to show another way that tables are visualized using something that's called an entity relationship model. So I'm going to go into database tools and bring up this thing that's called relationships, which you may or may not be familiar with. And this is a way to model tables that we already have or tables that we're going to create. It's a graphical way of modeling the tables that you've just seen. Now in Access, the way that we can do that is by simply dragging a table on here. So let's pick the department table and I drag it on, and you can see that the way that the table is represented is as a box. It's got the table name at the top and it's got the actual values that make up the columns inside that table displayed below, like that. So that's my department table, my department with all the different bits of data inside. Here's my employee table or my employee relation. I'll just make that one a little bit bigger so you can see all the things inside. There we go. Now clearly all I'm doing here is I'm showing a different way, I'm modelling, providing a different view on those tables that we already have. What you can do in most database products is you can actually design in this sort of relationship modeler, this entity relationship modeler, often abbreviated to ER. And what that will do is that will then actually create the tables underneath the bonnet. Third table that I have here is the grade table. Here it is. And you can see we've got the 3 familiar columns that we're used to. So here are my tables. In this model, we call these entities. So we've got 3 entities. And what we could do, we won't do it today, but what you can do is you can actually create relationships between these tables by dropping and dropping lines, dragging lines between the tables. And what that will do is that will set up things like foreign keys, primary keys and things like that. But I'm not going to talk about that today. Now the reason that this representation is interesting and useful is because it's the way that Mendix expects us to actually model our data. Now the place where we model the data is in this thing that's called the domain model. So if I double click on that, here we go. Now currently I've got no data, no model in my domain model at all. But if I click over here on the toolbox, you can see I've got entities and association and annotations. So let's drag an entity on. And it's a representation which looks very familiar from that entity relationship model diagram. We can see we've got a box and it's going to represent an entity. So we can visualize that as sort of underneath the bonnet of Mendix. What it's actually going to do is it's going to store this information in a database table. So let's double tap on the entity that I've just dragged in. What I can now do is I can customize that entity. So let's call it department. So this is going to represent our department information. Underneath the bonnet, you can imagine that Mendix is actually creating a department table. We always use singular here, by the way. We tend to anyway. So it's not departments, it would be department. So I've named my entity, but what we now need, of course, is we need to add, if you think of it as a table, we need to have the columns that make up that table. Slightly different language here. Mendix calls them attributes. So I'm just going to tap on new. What I can now do is I can add the attributes to my entity. So in other words, what we're doing is we're adding columns to the table that's being created underneath the bonnet. Now my department table's got 3 columns. The first one was called department number. And what I can do down here is I can change the kind of information that's going to be stored in that column. So this just happens to be an integer, so I'm just going to select integer. Now there are all sorts of things that we can do at this point. We can say it's a calculated value or stored value. We can add all sorts of error checking in, but I'm not going to do any of that with this. We're just going to keep it nice and straightforward. So it's just department number. It's going to be an integer. I click on OK, and you can see that in this panel down here. Now this is a very familiar layout in Mendix. You'll see this quite a lot, where you'll have sort of general information at the top of the dialog box, and then you'll be able to click new or edit or delete on a series of things that are displayed in a list in the bottom half of the panel. So I've got department number. Let's tap on new. The next field was called dname, and this is actually has a string inside it. It's words, so it's like accounting or marketing, something like that. Tap on OK, and then the final bit that we had here was this thing called loc, short for location. And again, that's going to be a string, so I just click on OK. Now if you make a mistake, you could single tap on one of these and you can tap edit and you can change it, or you can single tap and select delete, or you can just double tap and it brings up the dialog box so we can change the values. Now if I save that and I click OK, what you should be able to see now is that we've got a representation that looks very similar to that entity relationship diagram. We've got an entity called department, and it's got those 3 values inside it: department number, department name, and location. And what we'll do next is we'll actually create some interface elements that will use that entity.